It was late evening at Windsor. The palace, cloaked in silence, held secrets far deeper than its stone walls. Rain tapped gently against the tall glass windows as Prince William stood in his father's private study, a place once reserved for quiet reflection, state briefings, and handwritten truths never meant for public eyes. He wasn't supposed to be there. Not yet. Not like this. His father, King Charles III, had been gone only days. His final moments shrouded in both global mourning and deeply personal grief. But amid the noise of royal protocol, memorial arrangements, and public condolences, one item remained untouched. An envelope with William's name on it, sealed with wax, tucked away in a hidden drawer of the king's oak writing desk. He hesitated, his breath caught. The letter felt heavier than it should. With trembling fingers, William broke the seal. What unfolded wasn't just a message. It was a confession, a reckoning, a father's final attempt at truth. The ink had barely faded, yet the words pierced like fresh wounds. My dear son, if you're reading this, then you know I am no longer by your side. But I need you to hear this, not as a king, not even as your father, but as a man who failed to speak when it mattered most. William's knees buckled as he sank into the leather chair. His eyes scanned line after line, words soaked in decades of unspoken regrets, confessions tied to old wounds, and secrets about the crown's past that had been hidden even from him. The letter was not just personal. It rewrote his understanding of everything. His childhood, his mother's suffering, even the weight of the crown now pressing on his own shoulders. He was the future king, but in that moment he was just a son, shattered. Outside, thunder rolled in the distance. Inside, a royal heir wept in silence, alone, surrounded by power, yet stripped bare by a piece of paper and a lifetime of silence. And what exactly was written in that letter? What truth could shake the most composed member of the royal family to tears? The answers began, not with his father's final words, but with the storm that began long before the ink ever dried. To understand the weight of that letter, we have to go back, not just years but decades. Long before Prince William stood as heir apparent to the British throne, before the world saw him as the steady, composed royal, there was a boy who watched his family fall apart under the harsh spotlight of the world. The 1990s were not kind to the House of Windsor. The marriage of Charles and Diana was not just crumbling, it was disintegrating publicly. Their pain, their arguments, and their betrayals weren't whispered behind palace walls. They were printed in newspapers, dissected on TV, and consumed like scandalous entertainment. And William, he saw everything, not just through headlines, but from inside the palace halls where doors slammed and silence echoed louder than words. He watched his mother cry alone and later smile through her heartbreak. He watched his father disappear emotionally, absorbed in royal duty or in someone else. But what most didn't know was this. Charles wasn't heartless. Behind his stoic royal posture was a man tormented by guilt, by duty, by choices made not out of love but obligation. He had once been a young man deeply in love with someone the royal family deemed unsuitable. And from the moment he was told to marry Diana, a woman he respected but never truly loved, the seeds of regret had already been planted. Over time, those regrets grew into shadows that followed him through every engagement, every coronation rehearsal, and every family gathering. But he never spoke of them, not to the press, not to his advisors, not even to his children, until the letter. What William never realized was that his father had started writing it years ago, first as a collection of diary entries, then fragments of thoughts, and finally one cohesive letter that would become his final conversation with his eldest son. And in the years leading up to Charles's death, the two had grown closer publicly, yes, but also privately. William had begun taking on more royal duties, often standing by his father's side. They smiled, nodded, and walked in step, but between them remained a silent pact. To never revisit the past too deeply, to never say her name too often, to never speak of the why behind the emotional distance of those early years. But Charles had carried that weight for too long, and with time slipping away, he knew one day William would need the truth, not to forgive him, but to understand him. And so the letter waited, in a drawer, in silence, until the moment came when the son he could never fully reach would finally read the words he could never say out loud. From the outside, Prince William has always embodied composure, the perfect royal, the calm in the storm, a man shaped by tragedy, yet never broken by it. But what the cameras never captured, what even those closest to him never fully grasped, was the quiet war he fought inside. Because William didn't just lose a mother, he lost a sense of truth. He had grown up with fragments, whispers, incomplete answers. Everyone had their version of the story. The media, the monarchy, even his own parents at different times. But no one ever handed him the full picture. And so he built his own, one in which his mother, Princess Diana, was the victim of an unloving marriage, one in which his father, Prince Charles, was distant, perhaps even cruel, emotionally unavailable, and consumed by duty. Or Camilla. As he grew older, William carried that quiet resentment. Even as he smiled through family photo calls, waved to cheering crowds, and gave speeches beside his father, he wasn't angry, not visibly. He was something worse. He was confused, trapped between the man the public saw, King Charles, a grandfather, a statesman, and the man who had failed his mother. And yet, something in William resisted the full bitterness, because he wanted to understand. He wanted there to be more. He wanted to believe that the man who raised him, however imperfectly, had at least tried to do right by his children. But the palace was no place for emotional honesty. Feelings were folded into protocol, pain was dressed in designer suits, and duty-bound smile. And so, William did what generations of royals had done before him. He buried it. He buried the questions, the what-ifs, the aching silence. He became a father himself, and vowed to do things differently. More hugs, more bedtime stories, more emotional availability. With Catherine, he built a family grounded in warmth, not formality. But even then he couldn't shake it. How do you truly become a different kind of father, when your own never showed you how? How do you forgive a man who never said the words, "I was wrong"? That was the core of William's torment. Not rage, but longing. Longing for clarity, longing for answers, longing for connection. And then the letter came, and with it, the storm he had held at bay for decades was finally unleashed. Because in that letter, Charles didn't defend himself. He confessed. He named his regrets, not as a king, but as a man. He spoke of the pressure, of the palace machine, of his failure to protect Diana emotionally, of how he clung to tradition instead of fighting for love, of how his silence hurt his sons more than he ever admitted. "I watched you, William, so strong, so quiet, so loyal, and I realized, far too late, that silence is not strength. It's a wound dressed in armor." And with those words, the dam broke. For the first time, William wept, not just for what he had lost, but for what he had never truly received. A father's truth. The letter was only the beginning. Inside the envelope, along with the pages of his father's confessions, was something else. A key, small, tarnished, and unmarked. William recognized it immediately. It belonged to a private cabinet, one that sat in the corner of Charles's country estate at Highgrove. A cabinet no one ever opened. Staff had often assumed it was decorative, but William had seen his father glance at it during moments of solitude, often with a look that hovered between sorrow and fear. He never imagined it held answers, but it did. The very next morning, William made the quiet trip to Highgrove alone. No aides, no prep, just him and a memory-laced silence. As he turned the key, the cabinet creaked open like something sacred being disturbed. Inside were dozens of envelopes, neatly arranged and tied with faded ribbon. Each one bore a name. Some said Diana, some said Camilla, some said William and Harry. Letters Charles had written but never sent. Letters of rage, of heartbreak, of regret. Some dated back to the early 80s. Others were written as recently as a few months before his passing. William sat down, one by one, reading through the rawest parts of his father's soul. There were pages where Charles wept for Diana, where he admitted to not knowing how to love her the way she needed. She was light, and I was burdened by shadow. I should have stepped aside. I should have let her go freely. Instead, I held on, out of fear, out of duty. There were letters to Camilla, full of torment, not lust, wrestling with guilt over how much pain their love had caused. But the ones to William and Harry, they were devastating. In them, Charles wrote like a man who knew he would never be fully understood by his sons, who feared that his legacy would be one of coldness, not love. William, you have your mother's strength, and my silence. I only hope with time, you'll choose which of those to let guide you. Don't become me. Those words struck like thunder, because William had become his father in many ways, the stoic face of the monarchy, the symbol of continuity. But reading those letters, he realized what Charles had feared most, that his silence had replicated itself in his son. And now William stood at a crossroads. He could keep following the royal script, burying pain, performing duty, and wearing strength like a mask, or he could let this letter change him, not just as a man, but as a future king. And that in the quiet of that study, among dust-covered memories and unsent truths, became the turning point. For the first time in his life, William saw his father not as a distant monarch, but as a deeply broken man who had tried and failed to protect his family from a system that devours emotion in the name of tradition. He folded the letters gently, placed them back, and sat in silence. It wasn't just grief anymore, it was revelation. The funeral was watched by millions. World leaders bowed their heads. Choirs echoed through Westminster Abbey. The crown jewels shimmered atop the casket like symbols of unspoken weight. But amidst all the pageantry, all the rigid protocol, stood Prince William, changed in ways no one could see. He was composed, yes, but it wasn't the same composure. It was heavier, real, because the man he was burying that day was no longer just King Charles III. He was his father, flawed, human, full of fear, full of silence, but finally in the end, full of truth. And that truth had rewritten William's heart. In the days following the burial, as the world dissected every expression, every gesture, the palace released a carefully worded tribute, praising the late king's legacy, his environmental work, his global diplomacy. But William's personal message, posted quietly in the early hours of morning, told a different story. You taught me the burden of silence, but also the freedom that comes with speaking from the soul. For everything unspoken, I hear you now. Those words sent ripples across the world, subtle but unmistakable. And then, William did something no one expected. He took Diana's engagement ring, which Catherine wore with quiet grace every day, and brought it back to the very same place where his parents once stood, the sunken garden at Kensington Palace. There, without press or ceremony, he placed a small plaque near the roses his mother loved, and whispered a few words only Catherine heard. Let's begin again, but this time with truth. That moment wasn't just symbolic. It marked a shift in his path as the future king. He began requesting changes in how royal protocols addressed grief, mental health, and transparency. He truly spoke during engagements, not just from notes, but from the heart. In schools he talked about fatherhood. In interviews he referenced the quiet pain many of us inherit and never examine. He even initiated private meetings with his brother Harry, not public reconciliations, but silent olive branch. Because if their father's last letter taught him anything, it was this: you don't fix a broken legacy by hiding it. You face it, name it, and grow from it. The goodbye to King Charles was not marked by a grand speech or a golden statue. It was marked by a shift in William's soul, from heir to son, from performer to human, from silence to story. And as he stood beside his father's grave in Windsor, that final night, long after the mourners had left, William read one final letter, a reply he had written by hand. I forgive you, not because you asked, but because I understand now. And because I want to be a different father than the one you had to become. He left the letter folded beneath a white rose. Then he walked away. not as the man he had been, but as the king his father had hoped he'd choose to become. At first, it was subtle, a longer pause in William's public addresses, a gentler tone in interviews, a noticeable light in his eyes that hadn't been there since the early years of fatherhood. But for those who had followed the royal family for decades, the watchers, the loyalists, the skeptics, something had shifted. This was not just mourning, it was evolution. The media was cautious. They ran headlines like Prince William honors King Charles in quiet, emotional tributes, and the future monarch steps into a new role. But behind closed doors, royal correspondents whispered a different story. That something had cracked open in the walls of the palace, and that William had no intention of sealing it shut again. It wasn't long before the people noticed. During a visit to Manchester, a mother approached him with tears in her eyes and said, "Thank you for speaking the words so many of us needed to hear." In Scotland, an elderly war veteran held William's hand and whispered, "Your father never cried in public, but you did, and somehow that makes me trust you more." Online, the tide shifted. Posts circulated with clips of William tearing up at a memorial, of him gently comforting Catherine during a quiet moment in Wales, of him speaking to a young boy about losing a parent. Not with platitudes, but with sincerity. The hashtags began to change. From Prince William to the people's future king, from royal titles to human connection. Even within the royal family, walls began to soften. Catherine, who had always stood quietly beside him, began sharing more openly about their parenting, about grief, and about what it meant to raise children, with love and presence, not just responsibility. She was his anchor, his mirror, and now his co-architect in reshaping a monarchy once built on unshakable silence. Princess Anne, the ever-reserved royal veteran, reportedly told a close aide, "Your father would be proud of how he's carrying this." But not all reactions were warm. Some senior courtiers were uneasy. Tradition was being nudged. Lines were being blurred. Emotion was being brought too close to the throne. But even they knew this was inevitable, because the world had changed, and William finally, fully was changing with it. Even Harry, long estranged, saw the difference. Their reunion was not televised. No grand gesture, no headlines, but one quiet afternoon, William sent a letter of his own, not as a future king, not as the older brother, just as William. The note simply read, "I understand things I didn't before. Dad's gone. But maybe that's how we start talking again. When you're ready." Harry replied with a single word, "Soon." And that was enough. The letter Charles left behind had done more than bring a prince to tears. It had opened a wound, and in doing so it gave way to healing. Not just for a son, not just for a family, but maybe for a country watching and wondering if a monarchy could still have a heart. Shall I continue to the final part? Legacy, emotional reflection. You said, yes. ChatGPT said, thank you. Now we reach the soul of the story. The legacy, the emotional reflection, and the quiet lesson that remains long after the tears have dried. In the months following King Charles III's funeral, a stillness settled over the royal family. Not the cold, distant kind that once defined the monarchy, but a contemplative stillness, a pause between breaths, a moment to feel before speaking. And at the heart of it all stood William, not just the Prince of Wales, not just a man next in line, but a son, reshaped by grief, made deeper by truth, and softened by sorrow. He often returned to that desk, the one in his father's study, where the letter first unfolded like a storm across his chest. But now he didn't return to mourn. He returned to remember, because that letter had become more than a goodbye. It had become a guide, a map of what not to do, a confession that gave him permission to choose another path. And that path became his legacy in motion. He began sharing parts of his story carefully, not as a spectacle but as a way to teach. In a speech about fatherhood, he said, "My father loved us in the best way he knew how, in silence, in tradition, in structure. But I've learned that love sometimes needs a voice. That line echoed across the world, and many who had buried their own stories suddenly felt seen. Mental health charities reached out. Bereavement foundations quoted his words. Young people long disconnected from the stiff rituals of royalty began to lean in again, not because he was perfect, but because he was honest. He launched initiatives in his father's name. Yes, gardens, green energy efforts, and youth programs. But he also began something new, an archive of personal letters, curated and protected, where public figures could share words they were too afraid to speak aloud while alive. Letters of truth, pain, and forgiveness, preserved for the people they loved. He called it the silent room, because he said, some truths are too heavy for the living but too important for the lost. And within his own family, something bloomed. George began asking questions about Diana. Charlotte started writing letters to Granny Di. Louis once whispered, I hope you get to hug Grandpa now. The chain of silence had broken, and William, he no longer feared becoming his father, because in knowing Charles, truly knowing him, finally, he had made peace with the past, not by rewriting it, but by honoring its pain. And so, as years passed, and William stepped closer to the throne, people didn't just see a future king, they saw a man who cried, who listened, who loved, and somehow that made him more royal than ever. Because monarchy without heart is theater, but monarchy with truth, that becomes legacy. Call to action. If this story touched your heart, leave a buy in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe for more stories history almost erased.